The smell of rain on dry dust was the last thing I remembered of home, the scent of a world that was about to end, and I didn't even know it. It's a funny thing, the way a single sound can change a life. For me, it was the sound of a horse's hooves on the gravel, a sound I'd heard 1,000 times before, but on that morning it was different. It was the sound of a question that was about to tear my world in two. My father, Ezra, was hitching the buggy, the leather harness creaking with that familiar, comforting rhythm, the same rhythm that had woken me up every day for 23 years. I remember thinking the air felt heavy, like the sky was holding its breath, and the only thing on my mind was the strawberry preserves I was canning with my mother, the sweet, sharp scent of summer berries and sugar filling the kitchen. Then I saw the buggy. It wasn't ours. It was the bishop's. It was the same black, no-frills carriage that always meant someone was in trouble or someone was dead. I watched from the kitchen window as my father, a man whose hands were as large and were roughened as the earth he tilled, untied his own horse and led the bishop's mare to the hitching post. He didn't look at the house. He just stood there, his straw hat in his hands, as the bishop, Abram, climbed down with a grunt that seemed to belong to a much older man. He was a large, barrel-chested man, his voice as deep and rolling as thunder before a storm. They spoke in low tones, their heads bent together, and I couldn't hear a word they said. But I saw my father nod, his jaw set in a way that I knew meant he had just agreed to something he didn't want to do. My mother, a woman of quiet grace and endless patience, was already drying her hands on her apron and walking to the front door before I could even take a breath. I heard the door creak open, the familiar sound of the hinges my father had promised to oil for 3 years now. I heard my mother's soft, "Good morning, Bishop. Would you like some coffee?" And his deep, rumbling reply, "That would be good, Lydia, thank you." Then they came into the kitchen. My father first, his face a mask of stone, followed by Bishop Abram, whose eyes held a tight, forced smile that didn't reach them. The bishop settled his bulk into my father's wooden chair at the head of the table. This was wrong. No one sat in my father's chair, but my father just stood by the stove, his back to us, staring into the cast iron kettle as if it held all the answers. My mother poured the coffee, her hands steady, but I saw a tiny tremor in her fingers as she set the cup before the bishop. He took a sip, praised the coffee, and then he looked at me. His eyes, like little black stones, didn't leave mine as he placed his cup back on the table with a decisive click. "Sarah," he said, and the way he said my name made my stomach feel like it was full of cold, heavy stones. "Your father and I were just talking about the future, the community's future, and your future too." He had a habit of making everything sound like a sermon, even a conversation. I nodded, not trusting my voice. He took a sip of his coffee and then asked the question that would become the center of my world for the next year. "I understand you've been spending time with Jacob Yoder." It wasn't a question. It was an accusation wrapped in gentle tones. Jacob. His name was a warm sunbeam in my mind. He was the only person who could make me laugh until my sides hurt, the only one who saw the world not just as a place of duty and prayer, but as a place of beauty and joy. He was a carpenter, his hands smelling of sawdust and pine. He wasn't just a boy, he was my best friend, the one I had secretly promised my heart to, my love. "Yes, Bishop," I said, my voice quiet, respectful. "He helps me with the heavy work in the garden, and I help him with his letters. His English isn't so good." The bishop leaned forward, and the scent of his bay rum cologne, so foreign and sharp in our home, seemed to fill the entire kitchen. "That is a very dutiful thing to do, Sarah, a kind thing, but I have also heard he has become a distraction. I have heard his heart is not fully in the Ordnung, that he speaks of the outside world with too much fondness. He is a risk to the purity of our faith." My father flinched at that. He was a man of deep, abiding faith. He had never once questioned the bishop, never questioned the rules. It was the only way he knew how to be. He moved from the stove and stood beside my mother, his hand coming to rest on her shoulder. "Bishop," my father began, his voice a low rumble, "Sarah is a good girl. We have raised her to know her place, her duty." I saw my mother's lips press together, a thin, white line. I saw her eyes, for a fraction of a second, flash with something that looked like defiance, but she looked down at her hands in her lap. No, I was imagining it. I had to be. But it is not always what we know, Ezra, the bishop said, sighing like a man carrying a heavy weight. It is what we do. And what I have seen is a young woman who spends too much time with a boy who has been seen in the city, who has been seen reading books that are not approved. A boy who laughs too loud at the singing. I have discussed this with the elders. We are in agreement. Jacob Yoder is not a suitable match for a girl from a good family. You must put a stop to it, Ezra. You must forbid her from seeing him. The silence in the kitchen was so deep, I could hear the blood pounding in my ears. I looked at my father, willing him to speak, to defend me, to defend Jacob. He was a man who believed in fairness, in hard work, in the love of his family. But he also believed with every fiber of his being that the bishop's word was God's word. He saw me, his daughter, and in his eyes I could see the war. His world was splitting in two. I knew my father loved me more than anything, but the problem was he loved God even more. And the bishop was the one who spoke for God. I watched the battle in his soul, and I saw the moment he made his choice. He was a good man, but he was afraid. He was afraid of the bishop's disapproval, afraid of being shunned, afraid of the community that was his entire world. He was afraid for me, but he didn't know how to protect me within the rules of our faith. Sarah, he finally said, and his voice was the voice of a stranger. It was hollow, a sound I'd never heard him make. The bishop is right. You will not see Jacob Yoder anymore. You will go to the sewing circle with your mother this Thursday. And on Sunday you will sit with me and your mother, not with the Yoders. My heart went cold as the well water in winter. It wasn't the words he said, it was the way he said them. He didn't look at me. He looked at the bishop seeking approval. He had chosen the path of least resistance, the path of obedience, and in doing so, he was sacrificing everything I loved without a single thought for what I wanted. I was his daughter, and he chose the bishop's word over my heart. After the bishop left, the house felt empty and cold. My father went straight to the barn, leaving my mother and me in the sudden, crushing silence. I looked at her, hoping for some words of comfort, some sign that she was on my side, that she understood. She was wiping down the counter with a rag, her movements slow and deliberate. She didn't look at me. It was as if I had already become a ghost in my own home. I felt the world tilt. The familiar rhythms of my life, the smell of the fresh bread, the clucking of the hens in the yard, the warmth of the wood stove, suddenly felt alien, as if I was seeing them from very far away, a stranger peering into a life that was no longer mine. I didn't go to the sewing circle. I told my mother I had a headache, which was a lie, a sin I added to the growing list. Instead, I walked into the woods behind our farm, to a spot by the creek where the water babbled over smooth, gray stones. I sat there, listening to the birds, watching the sunlight dapple the forest floor, and I felt a rage building inside me that was as unfamiliar to me as the city's electric lights. I wasn't just sad. I was angry. I was angry at my father for his weakness, angry at the bishop for his self-righteousness, and angry at myself for being so helpless, for being born a woman in a world where my only power was to obey. A few days later, I managed to see Jacob. We met in the same place by the creek. He was as beautiful as I remembered, his blue eyes full of a worried light. He took my hands in his, and his touch was like a balm on a wound. "Sarah," he said, his voice rough, "I've been so worried about you. I saw your father at the market. He wouldn't look at me." "Jacob," I said, the words tumbling out. "The bishop came. He told my father to forbid us from seeing each other." A shadow crossed his face. I saw a flicker of something, not surprise, but a deep, weary sadness. "I heard he might. I heard some of the other men talking. They don't trust me. They think I'm a bad influence, because I ask too many questions." He had always been like that. He was a thinker, a dreamer. He was the one who saw the beautiful stained glass window in a fancy English church in town and wanted to build one for our own meeting house. It was a simple wish, a desire to bring beauty into our plain world, but the elders saw it as a dangerous vanity. He was the one who wondered if the old ways were the only ways, a question that was like a heresy in our district. He was different, and difference was dangerous. "You are not a bad influence," I said fiercely. "You make me see the world. You make me see the color in the gray." He smiled, but it was a sad smile. "But that's exactly the problem, isn't it?" He was quiet for a long time, just holding my hands, listening to the creek. The warble of a thrush echoed in the trees. I could smell the damp earth and the wild mint that grew along the bank. It was a beautiful, peaceful spot, the same spot where we had shared our first secret kiss, but today the peace felt fragile, like a thin sheet of ice about to break. Finally, he spoke, his voice so low I almost couldn't hear him over the water. What if we left Sarah? What if we went to the city? We could get married there. I could get a job. We could make a life for ourselves outside of this. His words hit me like a physical blow. Leave. The Amish life was all I had ever known. The church, the family, the rhythm of the seasons, the horse and buggy, the simple food, the plain clothes. The thought of leaving it, of turning my back on my family, was terrifying. But the thought of staying, of marrying a man chosen for me, of living a life of quiet, resentful obedience, was even more terrifying. Jacob, I can't, my father, I stammered. Your father chose the bishop over you, Sarah, he said, his voice gentle but firm. He made his choice, now you have to make yours. It was the truth, a cold, hard truth that sat in my stomach like a lump of uncooked bread dough. I'm leaving on the Monday after the harvest, he said. My uncle in Ohio has written to me. He says there's a community out there that is different. They are more open. He needs a carpenter. Will you come with me? He couldn't see it, but I had already been thinking about it. I had already packed a small bag. I had been hiding it at the back of my closet for a week. It was a sin, a betrayal, but it was also my only hope. I didn't want to leave my family. I didn't want to be shunned. But I couldn't live a lie. I nodded, a tear sliding down my cheek. Yes. The days leading up to my departure were the longest of my life. I went through the motions, helping my mother with the laundry, scrubbing the floors, churning butter. I was haunted by the rhythm of the house, the familiar sounds that were about to become memories, the creak of the stairs, the tick of the grandfather clock, the lowing of the cows in the barn at dusk. I spent hours watching my father, noticing the lines on his face, the way his big hands fumbled with the buttons on his vest. I felt a deep, profound sadness. I loved him. I knew he loved me. But he was trapped, as much as I was, trapped by a system of beliefs that demanded absolute obedience, a system that turned a father against his own daughter. On the day before I was to leave, I saw my father in a way I had never seen him before. It was late in the afternoon, and I was walking back from the chicken coop. I saw him standing at the edge of the field, looking out over the corn. The wind was blowing, making the stalks sway like a golden ocean, and he was just standing there. He didn't hear me approach. I saw his shoulders shaking. He was weeping. I had never seen my father cry, not once in my whole life. It was a sight so profound, and so private that I felt like a trespasser in my own heart. He was a good man, a decent man, a man who had followed the rules his entire life, and it had cost him his daughter. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to go to him, to throw my arms around him and tell him I forgave him, that I understood. But I didn't. I stood there, frozen, watching him, a witness to his silent, solitary grief. And for a moment, I saw him not as the man who had chosen the bishop over me, but as a man who was as much a victim of that choice as I was. He was a prisoner to a faith he couldn't question, and the price of his obedience was the loss of his child. That night during dinner, the silence was heavier than ever. We ate our stew and bread in silence. My father ate with his head down, my mother's eyes were red-rimmed. I knew she had been crying, I knew she knew. Mothers always know. I sat there, looking at the two of them, and a wave of guilt washed over me so powerful I could barely swallow my food. But I also felt a strange sense of peace. I knew what I had to do. I wasn't abandoning them. I was saving myself. And in the end, that was the only thing I could do. The next morning, I woke before dawn. The house was silent. I dressed in my plainest dress, the one I wore for work. I slipped my small bag out from under my bed and crept down the stairs. The old floorboards protested under my feet, the same protest they had offered up 1,000 times before as I had stumbled down for breakfast. I wrote a letter, a simple letter telling them I loved them, that I was sorry but that I couldn't stay. I left it on the kitchen table, beside my mother's pewter sugar bowl. I walked to the edge of the lane where the road met the main highway. The early morning mist was rising from the fields, turning the world into a muted, ghostly landscape. I saw the buggy approach, a dark shape in the gray. It was Jacob. He reached down and took my hand, pulling me up beside him. We didn't speak. He just clicked his tongue at the horse and we were off. I turned to look back at the farmhouse, but the fog had swallowed it up. it was gone. We drove for hours. The sun rose, burning away the mist, revealing a world I had only glimpsed from a distance. Cars whizzed past us, their speed and noise a terrifying assault on my senses. I saw houses with electric lights glowing even in the day, towns with signs and stores, and people who looked at us as if we were aliens. I was an alien. I had left my planet, my people, my family. We arrived at the train station in the city. It was a cavernous, echoing building filled with the smell of coal smoke and engine oil. It was terrifyingly loud. I clung to Jacob's arm, feeling like a small, lost child. The world was so big and we were so small. Jacob bought our tickets and we boarded the train. As the whistle blew and the train began to move, I watched the city slip away, replaced by the familiar countryside. It was a strange, dreamlike feeling, watching my old world recede, a world of buggies and farms and church, a world I would never see again. Life in Ohio was hard. Jacob's uncle had a small farm and he let us stay in the spare room. We were married in a simple civil ceremony, but the words didn't feel as holy as the ones I remembered from our Amish weddings. We went to a different church, a church with no bishop, no deacon, just a preacher who seemed to talk more about love and grace than about sin and obedience. The community here was different, more relaxed, but it wasn't my community. They didn't speak the same dialect of Pennsylvania Dutch I did. They didn't know the same songs. Every meal, every prayer, every conversation felt slightly off, like a song played in the wrong key. The guilt was a constant companion. I thought about my mother at the kitchen table, looking at my empty chair. I thought about my father standing in the field, his shoulders shaking. The worst part was the silence. At night, when the house was quiet and Jacob was asleep, I would lie awake, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the night, the hum of a refrigerator, the distant drone of a car on the highway, and I would be flooded with a crushing loneliness. I missed the sound of the wind in the corn. I missed the smell of my mother's bread baking. I missed the low murmur of voices during a church service. I had traded a life of spiritual certainty for a life of emotional freedom, and I wasn't sure which one was the prison. I was living the life I had chosen, but it felt like a play I was acting in, speaking lines I didn't fully understand, wearing a costume that didn't quite fit. Year passed. I learned to read English properly. I learned to drive a car, things that would have been unthinkable in my old life. We had a daughter, Miriam. She was beautiful, with her father's blue eyes and a laugh that filled the whole house with sunshine. Holding her in my arms for the first time was the first time I had felt truly peaceful since leaving the farm. Her future would be different. She would have choices. She wouldn't have to live under the rule of a man who could decide her fate over a cup of coffee. One evening, about a year after Miriam was born, I was in the garden pulling weeds. I heard the phone ring, an unnerving, jarring sound I had never gotten used to. I heard Jacob answer it. He was quiet for a long time, just listening. Then he called my name, his voice strained. When I got to the door, he was holding the phone out to me, his face pale. "It's your sister, Ruth," he said. I took the phone, my heart hammering in my chest. I hadn't spoken to any of my family in over a year. When I left, I had become dead to them. "Hello," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Sarah," it was Ruth's voice, my younger sister, the one I had helped with her sewing. She was crying. "Sarah, it's our father. He's very sick, Sarah. The doctor says it's his heart. He's asking for you." Her words hit me like a thunderbolt. He was asking for me. After all this time, after I had been shunned, after I had become a ghost, he was asking for me. "He is," I stammered, "but I'm shunned how?" "I know, Sarah," she said, sobbing. "I know, but he doesn't care about that anymore. He just wants to see you. Please, Sarah, he's dying." That night, I held Miriam close and I cried. I cried for the home I had lost, for the father I had left behind, for the years we had wasted. I cried because I was terrified. I was terrified to go back, terrified of the rejection, terrified of the judgmental stares of the community I had betrayed. I was terrified that the cost of my freedom had been the loss of the man I loved most, a price I wasn't sure I could bear. I thought of my father, a strong man broken. I thought of the pain in his eyes that day I had seen him weeping. And I knew I couldn't let him die without seeing him again, without trying to find some peace between us. Jacob was supportive, he always was. He offered to come with me, but I knew I had to do this alone. This was between me and my father. The next day I left Miriam with a neighbor and I took a bus back to Pennsylvania. The closer I got, the more the old world came back to me. The familiar green hills, the horses grazing in fields, the white farmhouses with their big, red barns. It felt like traveling back in time. When the bus finally pulled into the station in the small town near our farm, I was trembling. I didn't know what I was walking into. I hadn't been shunned exactly. I had been forgot. I was a cautionary tale, the girl who had chosen the world over her faith. I had no idea if my own mother would even speak to me. I walked down the familiar road, the gravel crunching under my feet. I could hear the clip-clop of a horse's hooves in the distance, a sound that was once the backdrop of my life. I turned onto our lane. The same lane I had walked down 1,000 times, the same lane I had walked down in the mist on the morning I left. The farmhouse looked smaller than I remembered, but it was still the same. The same white paint peeling on the porch, the same old windmill creaking in the breeze. I walked up the steps to the front door and knocked. The familiar, sharp sound of the knocker echoed. A moment later, the door opened. It was my mother. She was older. Her hair was all gray now, her face etched with new lines. She looked at me and her hand flew to her mouth. She didn't say a word. She just took me in her arms and held me. I had been so afraid of being a stranger in my own home, but in that moment I was her daughter again. She smelled the same, a mix of wood smoke and bread and lily of the valley. "Oh, Sarah," she whispered into my hair, crying. "My Sarah." She led me into the house. Everything was the same clock ticking, the same fire crackling in the stove. A woman I didn't recognize was in the kitchen, probably a neighbor come to help. She stopped and stared at me, her face a mask of shock and disapproval. My mother ignored her and led me straight to the downstairs bedroom, the one that used to be my grandmother's. The room was dim, the curtains drawn. A single lamp glowed on the bedside table. My father was lying in the bed. He was so thin, so fragile. This was not the strong, stoic man I remembered. He was pale, his skin like old parchment, his hands resting on the white sheet. His eyes were closed. For a moment, I thought we were too late. I stopped in the doorway, my heart a stone in my chest. Then his eyes fluttered open. They looked at me, unfocused for a moment. Then I saw recognition dawn in them. His mouth opened. "Sarah," he breathed. It was a sound of wonder, of disbelief. I rushed to the bedside and knelt, taking his hand in mine. His skin was cold. "I'm here, Father," I said, my own voice breaking. "I'm here." His eyes welled with tears. He closed them and a tear slid down his cheek. I thought you would never come," he whispered. "I came," I said. "I came to see you." We were silent for a long time. I just held his hand and cried. The only sound in the room was the ticking of the clock on the mantel. I felt the weight of the years between us, the weight of the unspoken apologies and accusations. "Sarah," he said, his voice so weak he was just breathing the words. "I was so wrong, I was so wrong." I looked at him, surprised. He had never admitted he was wrong about anything. It wasn't the Amish way. "No, Father," I said, the words tumbling out. "You were just trying to do what was right. You were trying to be a good man, to be faithful." "A good man," he said, a weak, bitter laugh escaping his lips. "A good man would have fought for his daughter. A good man would have had more courage. I was a coward, Sarah. I was afraid of the bishop, afraid of the church. I was afraid of what people would say. I chose my pride over my child." His confession was a knife in my heart. All my life, I had seen my father as a man who could do no wrong. He was a pillar of the community, a man of God. To hear him confess his failure to call himself a coward was more painful to me than his original betrayal. I saw the bishop's judgment of him had been his own judgment for all these years. He had lived with the guilt and the shame of his choice, and it had eaten him alive. My leaving hadn't just broken our family, it had broken him. "I did not choose the bishop over you," he said, his voice trembling. "I chose the path of least resistance. I chose the easy way, and I lost you because of it. My life is not a life of faith, Sarah. It has been a life of fear." He had been carrying this secret in his heart, the secret of his own weakness, the secret that he had chosen obedience out of fear, not out of love. He had been hiding behind his faith, using it as a shield to protect himself from the world. Now at the end of his life he was laying down the shield. "I forgive you, Father," I said, and I meant it. I meant it with all my heart. "I have been so angry with you for so long, but I'm not angry anymore. I understand now. I was afraid too, and I chose to leave. We both made choices that day. We both were afraid. Please forgive me for leaving." He squeezed my hand, the faintest pressure. "There is nothing to forgive, my daughter. You were right to leave. You were braver than I was." "You were always a good father," I insisted. "No," he said, opening his eyes and looking at me with a clarity that seemed to transcend his physical state. "I was a faithful servant to the church." But a good father would have put his daughter above the church, above the bishop. I realize that now. Do you understand what I am trying to tell you, Sarah? I did not choose the bishop over you. I chose you. I chose to let you go because it was the only way for you to have the life you deserved. I stared at him, the world tilting on its axis. I had spent years believing he had chosen the bishop over me. I had let that belief fester in my heart, creating a wound that I thought would never heal. But now, with his last breath, he was telling me the truth. He hadn't chosen the bishop. In his own way, he had chosen me. "I knew you would be strong enough to leave," he continued, his voice growing weaker. "I knew you would not stay and be miserable. I gave you the push you needed. I made the choice the bishop could see so you could make the choice he couldn't." Tears were streaming down my face. I hadn't just misunderstood his actions, I had misunderstood the very man himself. All those years of anger and hurt had been built on a foundation of sand. His stoicism, his silence, it wasn't indifference. It was love. It was a love so profound and so selfless that it had broken him to show it. "Father," I sobbed. "Take care of your mother," he whispered, his eyes already fluttering closed. Tell her I loved her. And Sarah, I am so proud of you." A few minutes later, he was gone. He died holding my hand. I sat there for a long time, my tears soaking into the white sheet. The room was silent, but it wasn't a silence of emptiness. It was a silence of profound peace. The weight I had been carrying for years, the burden of anger and resentment, was gone. I had come back to say goodbye to a man I thought had broken my heart, but instead I had discovered he had spent his whole life trying to protect it. My mother came into the room. She looked at me, then at my father's peaceful face, and she knew. She walked over and put a hand on my shoulder. "He loved you so much, Sarah," she said, her voice steady, "more than he ever let on." "I know," I said, looking up at her. "I know that now." I stayed for the funeral. I was shunned, an outcast from the community, but I sat in the back of the meeting house and I listened to the service. The bishop, Abram, spoke of my father as a pillar of the church, a man of unwavering faith. I listened and I felt a flicker of anger, but it was a distant, muted thing. I looked at his back, at his stiff black coat, and I realized he was as much a prisoner of his own beliefs as my father had been. He had a world to uphold, a system to maintain, and he did it at the expense of his own humanity. I visited my father's grave before I left. It was a simple grave, marked with a plain, gray stone. I knelt in the damp grass and placed a handful of wildflowers on the mound of earth. The wind was blowing, stirring the leaves on the trees. It was the same wind that had blown through the cornfield the day I had seen him crying. I thought about the life I had left behind, the community that had cast me out. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel bitter about it. I felt pity. I felt pity for a system that could make a man so afraid to love his own daughter. I felt pity for a faith that measured a person's worth by their obedience rather than the kindness of their heart. And I felt an overwhelming, all-consuming love for my father, a man who in his final act had shown me what true courage looked like. I returned to Ohio. I looked at my life, my husband, my daughter, and I saw it with new eyes. It wasn't a life of rebellion. It was a life I had chosen, a life I was grateful for. I no longer felt like an outsider in my own world. I had found my home. Years have passed since that day. Miriam is grown and married now. She lives in the city, and she has a life full of choices that I never had. I look at her sometimes, my beautiful daughter, and I see my father's eyes looking back at me. And I am grateful. I am grateful for the life I had, and for the life I made. I am grateful for the love I found, and for the love I was finally able to understand. I am not angry anymore. The anger is gone, replaced by a deep, abiding peace. Because I realized in the end that my father didn't choose the bishop over me. He chose a different kind of love for me, a love born of sacrifice and a silent, heartbreaking wisdom. He chose to let me go so that I could fly. And in that final, quiet confession, he gave me back my life and healed the heart he'd broken, not with his choice, but with the truth of why he made it. I have learned that the greatest acts of love are sometimes the ones we don't understand until the very end.